Hi, my name's Jack. I'm a 22-year-old software developer from the UK. I've had an interest in game development for years, which I really began to pursue around the same time I started my degree a few years ago. I've taken on a few different projects since then. Firstly, a shop tycoon type game, then a Zelda style adventure game, and most recently a side-scrolling RPG. Like anybody getting started in game dev, I had very little direction, scope quickly grew, and ultimately they were all abandoned before they'd even really gotten started. They were still great learning experiences though, and taught me a lot about Unity and game development in general. I want to get out of this endless cycle of projects though, and actually work something through from start to end. To make sure that happens, I figure I can do two things. For one, create this devlog. There are a number of creators who I love to watch in my spare time. For example, DevDuck, Thin Matrix and Randy are all super talented game developers and content creators working on their own projects. By doing this, I'm hoping to not only create some entertaining content to watch, but also should serve as extra motivation to progress and develop this game all the way up until a release, which is something I've not managed to achieve before. Secondly, and probably most importantly, define a nice narrow scope and make sure that I stick to it. I've been way too ambitious with past projects, and attempting to somehow build some sprawling RPG on my own while also having a full-time job is ultimately just unrealistic. So this time I'm going to go small and try to minimise and reuse assets as much as possible. After making all of these great decisions, I went ahead and did the exact opposite and started scoping out my dream game again, and in record time gave up and abandoned the video for a good few months. Then I had a nice, simple idea for a little puzzle platformer, and here we are. The gameplay loop is pretty simple. You're a torch, and you need to light a fire at the end of the level. Unfortunately, it's raining, so you're going to need to figure out a way to get to the end without getting extinguished. That's all there is to it. I've not really thought too hard about the various mechanics you could use to manipulate the level and keep your buddy under cover, but we'll figure that out as we go. I started by creating a Trello board and very roughly separating out some tasks into lists. My focus for this video will be getting as much of the core gameplay loop in place as I can, and hopefully a demo level set up by the end. After that, and in future devlogs, I need to start looking at some UI, expanding out into multiple levels and maybe worlds, and polishing things up before finally looking at a release. In case anyone is interested, I'll try and remember to leave a link to the board in the description after I've spent a bit more time fleshing it out. I started off by creating a Unity project, initializing a Git repo and getting the foundations in place. The first thing I implemented was the rain, as I could rip this directly out of my previous project and it will definitely serve as a solid jumping off point. There's nothing too complicated going on. It's a pretty simple Unity particle system with some variation in size and shape to each particle. It collides with other objects and shrinks along with a small reverse in velocity towards the end of its lifetime in order to simulate it bouncing off the ground. There's also some random wind variation, which I thought could be worked into an interesting mechanic. I added a simple slider to indicate how strong and in which direction the wind is blowing. I was thinking this could be useful for the player when trying to judge how and when to move in order to avoid the rain, and potentially even control the strength and direction to their benefit further down the line. Next, we need some fire. This was again purely made in Unity's particle system, and there's nothing particularly fancy going on here either. There are some particles floating upwards in a cone with some colour variation depending on time. It's relatively ugly, but that can be fixed later. Now the next thing that I wanted to deal with was the extinguishing and relighting of the flame. I considered going with an approach of when you get extinguished, the screen fades out and back in for a restart, but I figured it might be a bit nicer if instead you were able to go back and relight your torch from the beginning of the level, or potentially from a checkpoint later down the line. The logic behind this is very simple. If any particle collides with the torch, we're going to stop the child particle system from emitting. This means that when you step out into the rain, the second that first particle hits, the particle system stops. I then created a secondary, larger flame in the start location where the torch could be relit from. I marked this collider as a trigger, and the code for relighting the torch is just as simple. Just to briefly mention on the movement, I put zero thought into this for now and literally just copy and pasted Bracky's character controller in and left it. I can worry about some smoother platforming mechanics later. Finally, to complete the gameplay loop, we need a goal for each level. This will likely just be the same asset as the fire we can relight from, but starting as unlit. When the torch collides with this unlit goal object, the fire is then lit. Potentially we could also use this as a checkpoint system if we wanted multiple of these goals per level. The code behind this uses tags, so when the player collides with the object, it checks if the tag is finish, and if so, it starts the particle system on it. The first and simplest element of challenge that I'm going to implement is a moving platform, so that the player can time their movement to get to the goal. I wrote up a very simple script which only accommodates left to right movement for now, which I'll be later refactoring so that it can be reused for both horizontal and vertical platforms. I think there's now enough gameplay elements in place that we can build out a basic level. The first thing I did was draw up a very simple tile set so we don't get sick of staring at Unity's default blue and white. I got some rule tiles set up which allowed me to quickly throw together a shape that the player could jump around in. It's worth mentioning at this point that there's two levels of tiles, one which is visible and collides with the player to prevent them from moving outside the bounds of the level, and a separate layer with no sprite renderer that collides with the rain. This is because I want the rain to be able to pass through the ceiling but still hit the floor, while the player should collide with everything. Now that there's a level to jump around, let's reintroduce the platforms. I used the existing tile set to create a horizontal moving platform as well as an elevator type vertical platform. After adding colliders, I decided to refactor the moving platform script I had before to allow for both horizontal and vertical movement, which can then be modified from within the Unity editor, along with the speed and start-end positions. I also added methods for dealing with player collision. When a player is touching the platform, they will be set as a child game object to the platform. This is so that the player can smoothly translate along with the platform as it moves, rather than being left behind when moving horizontally or undergoing awkward and janky collisions when moving vertically. The final mechanic I wanted to implement was the inherent danger of being squished as soon as moving platforms exist in a game. I tried out a couple of different implementations of this, involving calculating distances between game objects and their bounding boxes, but in the end I found the most effective and simplest approach to be having a very thin child collider to the player. When another game object collides with the player, their box colliders will often begin to overlap until the point where the platform collides with their new inner collider, signifying that the player should have been squished and should die. For now, dying just resets the player to the spawn coordinates. One of the nice things about this implementation is that it will work for collisions from any direction. So if you get stuck under the elevator, or between the elevator and the ceiling, or between a horizontally moving platform and a wall, then all three should result in the same outcome. Finally, all that was left to do was drop the goal into the level, and now we have a fairly bare bones but playable level. For anyone who's made it this far, thank you so much for watching. This is the first one of these I've done, but I'm hoping I'll be able to keep up semi-regular devlogs for this project as it progresses. so please feel free to subscribe if you'd like to see them. Next time, I think I'll be working on some user interface and maybe a level select system. So until then, thanks again for watching and take care.